When it comes to other types of mourning, God forbid, I mean, nobody should know, for the most part, and you'll see an exception in a moment, and that exception is something that is relevant to our discussion here. But generally speaking, when we mourn for a loved one, and it's always difficult and very hard to lose a loved one, the mourning, I can't say that the loss is not there. The loss always is there, and we always miss the person. But the intensity of the severity of that feeling of loss, to some degree, I don't know if it's to say that time heals, or it's not as intense. Let's just say that it's not as intense as it was at the beginning. At the beginning, it's devastating. It's very difficult. It's beyond difficult. And slowly we ease into learning how to live life without it. But we don't have the same degree of mourning when it comes to the temple. We still have that deep-seated, think about the customs we do today. I'm going to talk more about those customs just now. But for example, we're going to dip eggs and ash, which egg symbolizes it's the food that a mourner eats because it possesses the ability of fertility within it, of regrowth. The roundness symbolizes the cycle of life. There's a lot of symbolism to it. But we eat that egg and ash every year on Erev Tisha B'Av. We sit on a low stool tonight. We do all the
Sound has gone.
Apologies to everyone. It seems like I got kicked out of the internet for a moment. Are we still live on our platforms? I hope so. I guess so. Not pleasant when we get kicked out and then it interrupts. What was I saying? That the customs that we're going to have today that we sit on a low stool, shoes, etc. I'm wearing my non-leather shoes already now because our maid at home, she took all 3 sets of my tackies, put them in the washing machine. I didn't know that that's the way you clean it. She discovered a new method how to clean the whole family's tackies together. So now we have a dozen sets of sneakers that are all shrunk, and some of them, not only did they shrink, the leather and everything got so, I don't know, she threw them out. She threw out 2 pairs of mine. 1 pair she left me because it looked okay, but it's wobbly and it's too small. So now I'm stretching it out. My feet are in pain. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. But otherwise, I have no tackies to wear tonight if I don't get this sorted. So I'm trying this out right now. I'm wearing my non-leather tackies and hoping that I'm going to stretch them out. The other 2 had rubber in them. The rubber ones she chucked because she showed me how bad they were. Anyways. Yeah, I don't know how that does. Why do you? Is this normal that people wash their tackies in washing machines? It made a mess of the washing machine. Yeah, I'm sure
No,
it did.
you must wash them in a pillowcase in the washing machine.
In the washing
yes.
machine.
Yes.
Well, too late now. I have no tackies left other than this 1 pair I'm wearing.
Sorry.
What's that?
Sorry.
Yeah. Slippers, right. I don't know about that. To go to shul in slippers, I'll be freezing. Not me. Anyways, why am I mentioning this? Not to slander my domestic helper, which I assume most of you don't know her anyways. Aubrey's here. Now it becomes a Yom Tov. Now it becomes a Yom Tov. Not to slander anybody, but just to say, I don't know why I'm saying it. The point is only that we have these customs that we do things, and let's try to understand this. And let's first take a look at the legal definition of mourning on Tisha B'Av and the place from which these practices flow. Obviously, sadness is, of course, one of the fundamental, powerful, evocative emotions in the human experience. That when we're sad, we are gloomy and downtrodden, and it's essentially our soul's response to misfortune. When it's the way we react to difficult situations. The experience of grief is often deep. It overwhelms our intellectual capacity. the way we feel when there's something that makes us sad, right? When we're brokenhearted. Now, while at first sadness can be quite intense, it is commonly understood that time heals many of our wounds. For some people, it takes longer. For some people, depending on the situation, like I said, but this is one of God's blessings, I have to say. It's not a curse that time heals. It's a good thing that time heals. And that we adapt and we have to move forward, which is why when a Shiva concludes, we tell the family to throw away their torn shirt. We tell the family, get up, get up, get up. We say it a few times. We say, go out. We escort them out of the home of Shiva. We take down the coverings of the mirrors and whatever customs of mourning. That you no longer sit on a low stool as much as, because we don't want you to stay in a place of sadness, of mourning. We want you, as difficult as it is, to move forward from a difficult situation. Time should heal. Without time and distance,
You're gone.
relatives, 7 closest relatives, which is a father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, and God forbid, one's son or daughter, right? God forbid, but unfortunately, now we got knocked off again. What's going on here? Why are we getting knocked off the internet all the time? Not what I intended. I'm sorry if we got knocked off. Okay, guys, give me a second to let the internet back on. I don't know what happened here. Just a second. So while it's hopefully reconnecting to the internet, I want to just continue on this theme. The idea then, of course, is that it's a blessing God gives us that time should heal, which is why we have the different stages of mourning from a halachic perspective. What are the stages? When a person first loses their loved one, they are in a state of omen, they're like in limbo. And then after the funeral is a little bit less intense. In the 7 days of Shiva, they say even the first 3 days are more intense than the remaining 4 days. And then after Shiva, which is a week, is Shloshim, the 30 days. And then after Shloshim is the 11 more months, the full year. And then a person integrates back into society. Halachically, they don't have to not attend concerts. They should start enjoying life again. That's the halacha. And if a person is stuck in that quagmire, in that state of sadness, it's our task and responsibility as friends, as neighbors, as relatives, to help schlep them out of it. It's normal for a person to be sad when they lose a loved one, but they cannot be stuck there. And if a person is stuck there, they might need the help of a professional to help them get through it, and support and friendship and love. That's what people need. So it's important that we provide them with those opportunities and be there for them. But that, of course, intensifies my question. Jewish law recognizes that the healing effects of time, that time heals. And we see it in halacha. Like I said, let me just put it on the screen. Here you see in Shulchan Aruch, if you could see the top screen, sorry for those who want to join us online. Until we get back on the internet, you will have to just suffice with my commentary. Yeah. So as time heals, that is the thing. And then the practices for mourning are as such. But when it comes to mourning for the Beis Hamikdash, is that the case? What happens? How do we mourn for the Beis Hamikdash? We didn't stop mourning for it. Unlike a loved one who we lost, that there's the stages of till the funeral, from the funeral, the 7 days, the 30 days, the year. It's 1,953 years later now. And we're still mourning for the destruction of the temple. Right? So we haven't moved on. Why is that? Okay, so certainly, and that's part of it. We're going to get to that. I just want to try to get back on the internet here to be able to share the shear. So give it a moment. I want to put the text up here. But the idea that we need to understand is, why is it that we are still in this intense morning? What I'm going to do is, for now, I'm going to put the Gemara on the screen, and let's learn it in the Gemara. Okay, you see it here from the Talmud, text 4. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, our sages have taught, Kol mitzvahs hanayagos ba'avel nayagos b'Tisha B'Av. All the practices, all the laws that one does, observes for losing a loved one, we do as well on Tisha B'Av, right? You're familiar with it. Just like a mourner doesn't bathe, we don't bathe. Now, today you could say, because mourning is 7 days, maybe in times bygone, the truth is, I don't think I bathed once during Shiva, except for Erev Shabbos for my parents. So it's uncomfortable, but we don't bathe during the week of losing a loved one. The halacha says you can put on deodorant. I read even for Tisha B'Av, because I grew up knowing you don't even put on deodorant. But I did read in modern contemporary halacha that today's, especially when it's summer now, and in Israel and Europe and in the States, anywhere in the northern hemisphere where it's the heat, the intensity of the heat, it might be a good idea for body odor not to get out of hand, that people put on deodorant, but maybe an unscented deodorant. If you want to wear cologne or perfume, you put it on now, you don't put on tonight, because Tisha B'Av is not a party. Tisha B'Av is a fast. Important because tonight Tisha B'Av begins. So before the fast starts at sunset, which is 5:35 p.m. today. That means you finish all eating before 5:35. Good idea to drink water today. Good idea to eat foods that are, I don't know what kind of foods. You tell me what works for you. I don't find that. Thank God I'm an easy faster. But maybe let's get some tips from people more experienced than I. What? You got the salt. I've already had 4 coffees. How many more am I allowed? What else? Carbohydrate-rich food.
Carbs, lots of carbs.
Lots of carbs, you say. Okay,
Yeah.
Lots of carbs, Raz says. Good. I'm just going to put the connect code in here because it seems to be not connecting. Lots of carbs, okay? What else? There are other things. What's that? Food. Okay, as long as it's food, Rosemary says. You got reserves already. Okay, just a second here. Can't understand. Fish. The point ultimately is you're going to eat foods that are going to help you with the fasting, but you're going to fast. So in a sense, it's more intense because a mourner doesn't fast. A mourner just, for the first, till the funeral, they don't eat wine or meat like we don't do this week. And then after the funeral, they're even allowed to eat wine and meat. They just don't, I guess, luxuriate or whatever you want to call it, indulge. But even that, there's no law that they can't. Yet we don't eat at all. No eating, no drinking, no intimacy, no leather shoes. We sit in a low stool just like a mourner does. We don't put on any perfumes or ointments. What do you say, Tzipar? Like Yom Kippur, exactly, the same laws as Yom Kippur. But Yom Kippur, ultimately, we know we're going to be forgiven and atoned for our sins. There's a more celebratory kind of feeling. Here, it's a very intense and sad feeling because it's not about forgiveness, atonement. It is about remembering all the tragedies that befell our people. And the halacha continues. We don't wear leather shoes, just like a mourner doesn't wear leather shoes for the whole week. So it's also forbidden to read from the Torah, the prophets, or the writings, or the study of Mishnah, or the Talmud, or the Medrash, whether legal Medrash or narrative Medrash. There's a whole lot of laws, just like a mourner, by the way. Why is a mourner not allowed to study these things? We're going to discuss that in a moment, more detail. But we're supposed to study Torah with joy. Right? The Torah is supposed to give us joy when we study Torah. Pardon? It wasn't a happy story. No, we're not talking about it being a happy. We're going to talk about transforming it to happiness in a moment. But the point I'm making is that it's very much like when you mourn for a loved one. But there are some differences that I need to put up here on the screen. And what are the differences? The difference is, the Gemara says, you are allowed to read parts of Tanakh that one is unaccustomed to reading and study parts of the oral law that one is not used to studying. You're allowed to read from the book of Lamentations, of Eicha, which we're going to read tonight. You're allowed to read from the book of Job, of Eov, because Eov is one of the biblical figures who had a very sad life. He lost his fortune, he lost his family, he lost everything. You're allowed to read the sad parts of Torah from Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu the prophet, even school children. My kids don't have school tomorrow. There's no school on Tisha B'Av. And so the thing is, the verse says, Pikudei Hashem Yesharim, the commandments of Hashem are right. Mesamchei Lev, they bring rejoicing to the heart. So since when you study Torah brings you joy, well, we say that you're not supposed to be joyous on this day. Hence, that's why we are in this state. What's that?
We read Kinos.
We read Kinos. Yeah, but that's sad. That's sad stuff, right? The Kinos is not losing the internet here again now. Okay, so the point is we're reading stuff that are not of the happy genre, right? Torah study brings joy, and we don't want to be happy on Tisha B'Av. This is a day where we manufacture sadness. We don't even greet somebody with our hand. By the way, I'm thinking about that. I don't know, this is just my own epiphany, my own idea. You know the story we said about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the Gemara says, that story is what caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. I think I told you the story in Monday's shir. Yeah? So why can't we extend a hand of Tisha B'Av? Maybe to reenact that story, to remember that the host refused to accommodate Bar Kamsa at his function, at his banquet. And therefore, we want to remember that. This is a day of sadness because of baseless hatred. So we emphasize, you like how it feels when somebody doesn't extend their hand to you, greet you? No, you don't like that, so don't do that. So once a year, we do it intentionally so we know what it feels like so that we won't experience that in the future. Just an idea, a thought, perhaps. You don't greet a mourner, right? And at Tisha B'Av, we don't greet each other. Exactly the point. Okay, so unfortunately, the screen is only going to be for the people who are here because I can't, for some reason, the internet's giving a lot of trouble. Anyways, the point is, when it comes to a mourner, there is some ambiguity, call it. Some opinions say that all Torah study is forbidden to an actual mourner. And this you could see in the Gemara, in the Halacha here. The Gemara says that Asur Likros Batorah. What does it mean that you're forbidden to study Torah? And it says here that a mourner can't even read the book of Job, Lamentations, or the sad parts of Jeremiah because they're not, I don't know, he gives a reason behind it. But the point is that all Torah study is forbidden to a mourner, to somebody who's in mourning, without exception. Right? Even the sadder books, such as Eicha, Lamentations, or Job, or Jeremiah. So Tisha B'Av, in some ways, as we stand now, is more lenient. But there's another difference between the laws of mourning and the laws of Tisha B'Av. A mourner does not wear tefillin only on the first day of mourning, and even still, the Chabad custom is that we do wear tefillin just without a blessing. Why? Again, the same idea. Tefillin is considered an honor and glory to the wearer. It's a way connecting with Hashem in a joyous way. It's like, in fact, it's referred to in halacha that the tefillin is like a crown on your head, right? What's that? It's an ornament, yes. And so such visions of majestic grace seem inappropriate during a time of sadness and grieving. So a mourner doesn't wear tefillin until after the funeral of their beloved departed. Yeah. Yeah. There are parts related to mourning. Mourning. No, there are parts. Sure, that there are specific the laws of mourning. A mourner studies. A mourner, for when somebody loses their relative, the focus and emphasis should be about the relative during that week. And they talk about that and share memories and stories. But what do they learn? I mean, I've been in mourning, unfortunately, twice, more than enough. And one studies matters related to mourning, sadness. There's plenty of parts, there's no shortage of what to study in that sense. But the second comparison I'm making here is when it comes to tefillin. On Tisha B'Av, we're not going to wear tefillin tomorrow morning at Shabbos, right? Mincha you will. So we delay it to the afternoon. Now, why is the burning of the temple already started earlier on, right? Although the temple continued to burn throughout the day, but the burning of the temple, we consider the initiation. Remember, we had this discussion yesterday. Which is considered worse, like the 9th of Av or the 10th of Av? One of the sages in the Talmud said, I would institute we should fast on the 10th, but the sages didn't agree with it. Why did he feel that the 10th? Because he said more burning happened on the 10th of Av. Why, by the way, although tomorrow by 6:03 p.m. the fast ends, you still can't eat meat, and you still can't listen to music, and you still can't do a variety of things until Friday afternoon, right? So because you can't do those things till Friday afternoon, is in order to commemorate the burning that continued, that the temple was continuing to burn down. So let's look here at text 6 at the bottom, and it says it's logical to assume that we're obligated to put on tefillin on Tisha B'Av, since the ban on wearing them applies even to mourners only on the first day. And Tisha B'Av is certainly more lenient than the 7 days of mourning. But we're seeing a comparison and we're seeing a contrast. No? You noticing? The comparison is we don't wear tefillin, just like a mourner doesn't wear tefillin, but only the beginning of the day. But basically the point I'm making is that the morning of Tisha B'Av, the sadness that we experience tonight and tomorrow, Tisha B'Av, you see it. It's expressed in the laws and the customs that mimic the laws that are related to losing a loved one, right? But there are certain differences. On the one hand, some of the differences show that it's more lenient, but on the other hand, it seems to be more strict. Let's look at one or two more texts and then we'll try to analyze this a little bit more. Here's something the Gemara says. Rav Ashi, by the way, who is Rav Ashi? I just want to say that if Rav Ashi said this, Rav Ashi and Ravina were the two authors, the compilers, the redactors of the Gemara. When we talk about the Gemara, there were two main people responsible for putting all of the Talmud together. Who were those two people? One, his name is Ravina, and the other's name was Rav Ashi. This is Rav Ashi. What did Rav Ashi say? A new morning differs from an old morning. Fresh mourning for a recent loss is unlike the old communal mourning of Tisha B'Av. And therefore, Tisha B'Av, he says, is more lenient. Now, that's a little interesting because while we're still doing all these things to mourn on Tisha B'Av, right? At the same time, we realize it's an ancient mourning. We're mourning for something 1,953 years ago. And many things that happened in between, as we elaborated yesterday. But the Gemara is saying it's an old mourning. And that's why you have these limits. So there's two qualities of Tisha B'Av that make it more lenient, the Gemara is telling us. And both, you could say it's the fact that it's an old suffering. In fact, the Gemara says the fact that so many people suffered is already half the comfort. This wasn't something one individual, you lose your loved one, God forbid, you're suffering alone. Yes, that's why it's a mitzvah for us to come visit a mourner. In fact, the Gemara tells us, if you have time only to visit one person today, I think about my day yesterday. I went to 2 houses in the morning, I went to a hospital. It's tough and you have to get some work done in between. And there's lots of things that have to happen. And there were certain things that didn't happen that I don't know when I'm going to get them done. But the halacha says, if you only have time, let's say, for one visit, either somebody who's sick in hospital or somebody's mourning a loved one, which one do you think you should go to? No? Aubrey got it. Why? Says the halacha, because when you're visiting a mourner, there's two people being comforted, the mourner and the one being mourned. The soul itself gets comfort by you visiting them. Obviously, ideally, if you could visit a person who's sick and a mourner, how good. But if you can only visit one, then the mourner is the one who takes the precedence. The mourner, in a sense, needs it more than the person who's sick in hospital. And now that seems a little bit counterintuitive. If the person is sick in hospital, my mind would have said that I think that person needs a visit, an upliftment. But the halacha says, no, the mourner might wind up in a hospital if you don't go visit them. They need all that support. So it's actually interesting that we do that. And the fact that we're not mourning alone, and which is why one of the reasons when the traditional words of comfort to somebody who's mourning, what do we say to them? That Hashem should comfort them amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Because when it comes to Zion and Jerusalem, we are all mourning together. All of us observe Tisha B'Av. When it's a mourner for their loved one, only the mourner themselves feels the intensity of the pain. What we're saying is we're coming to take some of that pain from you. We're coming to share that pain. But realistically speaking, the mourner themselves are the only ones who really feel the pain. No one else can truly empathize and realize what that person has. We try. That's why we visit a mourner. And we say those words to say, just like when it comes to Zion and Jerusalem, that every single one of us mourns for it, we want to be part of your mourning too. Now, halacha recognizes that fresh personal loss will inevitably be more powerful than an ancient shared tragedy. And that's why the halacha that tells us the laws relating to mourning for a loved one versus the laws related to mourning for the temple. So that's why there are these aspects of Tisha B'Av that is different than the mourning for a loved one. So we see the leniencies, and they're not meant to mitigate the severity of all the calamities and tragedies that befell our people throughout our history. That's not the idea. But the point is, halacha recognizes the limits of human nature and the human psyche. We could go to Israel today. I saw somebody posted something about one of the rabbis who was visiting the Kotel and was crying. He had his grandson with him. And the grandson asked, why are you crying? He said, because I'm crying about the destruction, the Churban Beit HaMikdash. And the grandson asked, but do you believe that Mashiach will come? He says, yes, of course. It's a basic tenet of Jewish faith. I believe any day that Mashiach could come speedily. So he says, well, if that's the case, you believe that Hashem will build the Beis HaMikdash? Well, you already see now, we have one of the walls. God only needs to build 3 more walls. One of the walls is already there. That's a good perspective to have, right? But our sages recognize that time passes and heals, and the idea that we're all mourning together and the pain of grieving is naturally less intense. So when a radio host asks me the question, why is it that we're mourning, can't we get over it mourning for a building of bricks and mortar? I can understand, it seems like why are we mourning for a building of bricks and mortar? It doesn't seem to make sense. It's not something that we can relate to. But of course, we're not just mourning for the building. We are mourning for all of the tragedies that befell our people, specifically, that were a result of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and our exile, etc. Let me just try to reconnect to the internet here, if I can put this back on the screen. Pardon? Who asked what? Yeah, Napoleon. I told that story yesterday. And Napoleon said that people who can still mourn for an event that took place so long ago, such a people will no doubt, they'll experience the rebuilding of their temple, etc. Just a second, let me just put this screen back up. Okay, so that's where we left off till now. Are we back on? Okay, good. We don't need this here on the bottom. How do I get? Pardon? No, all the tragedies that befell our people in between. Yes, of course. That's all part of it, no doubt. Now, 100%. But of course, you're absolutely right, Aubrey. But we're mourning the departure of the Shekhinah. The truth is no. The Gemara says Shekhinah leidus azmin kana. Divine presence is always still there, but it's in captivity. It's not the same. Can you read Tehillim? Yeah, I would say you could read Tehillim. Yeah. Yeah. I just reconnected it to Chabad. Now we're back on. Anyways, it's back on, so not to worry. All right. So, ladies and gents, as we continue this discussion, and let us continue. So, we recognize that the various mornings, that the things that we do, but our question, there's still part of the question that I want to discuss. And that is, granted, our mourning is less intense than it would be for a recent loss. But how can even this lesson mourning continue indefinitely? It's a temple that existed nearly 2,000 years ago, 2 millennia ago. Why is there no set limit on the number of years that we can mourn for the ancient calamities? There's a limit in halacha on how long you mourn for a loved one. So why is there no limit? Why don't we forget about it and move on? And while we talk about that, why don't we forget about the Holocaust and move on? Why don't we forget about the Spanish Inquisition and move on? Why don't we forget about apartheid? Why don't we forget about other things? Right. But that's the point I'm making. The rear view mirror in your car is, you always have to look back at it to make sure you don't get into an accident, but it's smaller than the windshield, which will show you ahead. We have to be forward thinking. So let's talk about that now, because we often see sadness as unfortunate, but an unavoidable part of life. It's part of the cycle of life. And oftentimes people will say that. Sometimes people say senseless things when they go to a shiva home. They don't even realize. No, it shouldn't be part of a life that a parent buries their child. No, that shouldn't be a part of life. And that's what makes that all the more tragic and difficult and harder. So even though it's part of the human experience and people have had it, in fact, when I was learning the Gemara earlier today, the Gemara says that they used to come to the home of a mourner and they had a whole list of blessings they would say. And one of them was, and they took this one away. One of the sages back then said, Harbe Yishtu. No, I'm forgetting the words. Forgetting the Gemara words, the original. Harbe Shasu Harbe Yishtu. That's in the Gemara. Many people drank and many more people will drink. Meaning, what did they say? Unfortunately, as tragic as it is that you experience, I'll get a little personal for a second, Rosemary. You sadly lost your son in a car accident a few months ago. And this week we lost a young man in the community, and his parents, I went to their shiva home yesterday to be there with them. It was very, very difficult and intense to be there with them. So the Gemara, this sage in the Talmud said, we tell people maybe as a measure of comfort, Rosemary, we're so sorry for your loss. You're not the first one to experience it, and you won't be the last. And you know what the sages reprimanded this scholar? They said, we don't speak that way. We don't speak that way. Is that a comfort to you that you're not the last one to lose a child? God forbid. Don't speak like that. Your loss is so immense and intense and deep. It's your loss. You can never compare your loss to someone else's. Besides the point, is that a comfort? And besides the point, do we want to say that more people should experience tragedies? God forbid. And they took that, they said that's inappropriate, it's insensitive, we're not going to speak like that. But yeah, of course, and each person experiences that in their own way. And although it might be part of the human experience, if we're given the choice, the ability to be spared, not to have it, of course we would, right? We don't want that. What benefit comes from negative emotional responses? We don't want to be in a state of melancholy, of morose, of things that happen. But like everything else in life, sadness is created by Hashem. God created it. It's part of the fabric of human nature, right? And we have a responsibility to discover the purpose of sadness. What's it for? The way in which it fits into the divine mission and purpose. And how can we use sadness responsibly? And in fact, there's a verse that tells us, it's a verse in Mishlei in Proverbs. What is King Solomon, very wise man, says to us? B'chol etzev yihi mosar. In every suffering, there has to be a benefit. What's the benefit in the suffering? And therefore he says, "Dvar svasayim achla machzor," but the talk of the lips leads only to poverty. Talk is cheap. Right? And in this stirring verse, King Solomon tells us that while sadness is indeed rough, but he says, Yihi Amosa, there's an advantage, there's a benefit that can come from sadness, from suffering. And it's explained in Tanya. If you read the verse, if you can't read it, I'll read it aloud for you on the screen. This verse, no sadness, that could be a benefit. The implication is that sadness has no inherent virtue. Sadness itself is not a good thing. Rather, that some profit is derived and experienced from it. The true joy in Hashem, which follows from the genuine anguish over our sins at the right time, the bitterness of soul and a broken heart. So what's the Alter Rebbe telling us in Tanya? That true joy can come from genuine, sincere anguish. That good can come out of true sadness. A bitterness of soul and a broken heart, in his words. How is this accomplished? How do you achieve? What's the benefit? How do we find good even in the negative emotion of sadness? Where do you find the good in it? The answer lies in appreciating the form of sadness. And this is something, if you study Tanya talks a lot about, there's two things. One is sadness versus bitterness. What's the difference? It's not semantics. These two emotions are profoundly different in the direction. Where does it take me to? Not where am I now? What's going to result from it, right? Sadness is a heavy emotion. It lowers our spirit. It puts us in a downtrodden place. A person feels disheartened, weakened, tired. We feel weighed down by the difficulties in life. And the common response to sadness is the desire to throw in that towel of despondency, to lie belly up, to escape from suffering. What can I do? Nothing. And people feel completely inactive. What good can come from it? But the Alter Rebbe is telling us about another type of sadness. And that sadness, which he calls bitterness, is different. Because this is, although I'm in a bad place, the idea is it's a galvanizing emotion that propels the spirit to action. What is going to come from this? Rabbi Soloveitchik would take the verse and tell him, where King David says, Keli, Keli, lama zavtani, my God, why have you abandoned me? And he says that's the very same word, lama, can be read as lama. For what purpose? For what benefit? Hopefully, it's a springboard that pushes us, that changes our perspective. I see it in a different way. It's a rebellion against the current state to say, this is unacceptable. What am I going to do about it? It should move us to do something, right? What am I going to do? And this is something the Alter Rebbe discusses in Tanya about how it has to be an impetus for personal growth. It should propel an individual to better behavior. Lema, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said. For what purpose? What is going to come from this? How am I going to change? Right? That's the question. Let me try to get this back on here. I don't know why it just keeps kicking me off, which is a real pain in the neck. To be kicked off the internet constantly. This is going to be one of the unpleasant YouTubes to watch in the future because we keep getting knocked out. It's also a message for me. What's the message? Wow. So the point, of course, is that how am I going to grow from this? What am I going to do? How am I going to change? What's going to make me a better person? And that every person has to ask themselves, how am I improving? What difference is it making? How am I becoming a better person as a result? Now you look in our community right now, how many mitzvahs people have taken on in honor of Chaim Sarki, right? So people are growing. People are doing something to become better. Now it's possible that if a person is troubled by something, do I do nothing or do I do something? What am I going to do? Is it going to transform me into a better person? And then King Solomon says based on that, that's when we know that the sadness has an advantage to it. Positivity can come out of sadness, even though sadness itself is not a good thing. But King Solomon is telling us that b'chol eitzav yihamoso, there's a benefit. What's that benefit? Yes. So our evil inclination might try to sadden us. There are people, we go in dips, we go up and down. That's life. I get knocked down, but I get up again. It could drain us of our energy every time we get knocked down. And we have those dips and we feel depressed and sad and all. But that sadness is created by Hashem. And if there wasn't a benefit or a reason for it, God would not have created it. And therefore, we have to see the opportunity to transform it into something energizing, to something positive and good. That's our responsibility when it comes to grief, because grief can be the pathway to something good that could come out of it, even though it itself is an undesirable experience. We don't want sadness. But imagine if you seize the opportunity in that sadness to become a better person. So we can become better people. It could be a springboard for growth. And this very idea that sadness can be positively mobilized is very much what the Mishnah tells us about Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah teaches that once we've entered the state of mourning, what does it say? Mishenichnas Av mema'atim b'simcha. When the month of Av, this month begins, mema'atim b'simcha. What does that mean? We reduce our joy. Well, one way of seeing it is, we got to be sad. It's a mitzvah to be sad. Let's look at the Shulchan Aruch. What does it say in Shulchan Aruch? That from when Rosh Chodesh begins, we have to reduce our business dealings. We can't build. There's so many restrictions. I'm not even going to go into all the details. You can read it on your own. We don't have weddings. We don't listen to music. We don't eat meat. We don't drink wine. Right? All the things of this week's Sabbath. So the halacha elaborates on all the specific rules of how we're meant to decrease the joy. Yeah, we have rules. This is how you observe the month of Av. But I have a question for you. This statement, Mishenichnas Av Mematim B'Simcha, is very similar to another statement we say, which is Purim. Thank you, Tzipara. What do we say when it comes to Purim? Mishenichnas Adar Marbi B'Simcha. When the month of Adar comes, we increase in our joy. Do you notice a difference? What's the difference? Okay, so when Adar comes, we increase in joy. Yet, when it comes to Adar, there's no rules of how you're meant to increase in joy. How do you want to increase in joy? You want to dance, because they hate dance. You want to have a l'chaim, have a l'chaim. We have no rules specifically telling us how to increase in joy. Yes, when it comes to Purim, we have specific rules of what we're supposed to do. How the rules of Purim, how we're supposed to read the Megillah and have a meal and give gifts to the poor and give meals and share goodwill gestures with friends. But for the month of joy, it doesn't tell us how we're meant to increase in joy. In the month of Av, it tells us exactly. So why are there no particular rules given for how we're meant to increase in the joy? But there are rules given how to decrease in the joy. So let me share with you a beautiful answer from the Minchas, I think it's the Minchas Elazar, Rabbi Chaim Eliezer Shapiro, the Rebbe of Munkach. Let's read it together. It says, when we enter Adar, we increase in joy, but the Talmud doesn't tell us how we're supposed to increase in it, right? It teaches us to increase joy almost as a tangential remark, but there's not a general principle that the positive is greater than the negative. You can read this at your leisure. I want to just summarize it. What he's telling us is, in Adar, there's no limit to how much joy you can increase. But in Av, when it comes to sadness, that's contained, that's confined, that's limited. The sadness is something that is not meant to be increased. We decrease, but only in these specific areas. When it comes to sadness, the Talmud is careful to define the limits of our obligation. There's a limit to how sad you can be. God forbid you lost a loved one, we have rules, restrictions of how sad you should be. There are days of sadness and then done. Yes, you feel the sadness inside, but we are meant to pull you out of that sadness. When it comes to a wedding, do we tell you how much you're supposed to dance at your child's wedding? No, because that joy should be boundless. But sadness has its limitations. And that's the idea. sadness does have limits. And I think it's a beautiful idea. The sadness has a precise, specific rules of how sad you're meant to be, but not any more than that. Joy, on the other hand, that we don't have rules of how joyous you should be. Be ecstatically joyous. There's no limit to how joyous you should be. There's no such thing as you're too happy. You're too happy? No such thing. Keep increasing the joy. More joy is good. The notion of a healthy, purposeful sadness is something that we learn in Tisha B'Av. Yes, and in fact, King Solomon says there's a time and a place for everything. For somebody to be happy tonight is misplaced happiness. You have to be sad on Tisha B'Av, and you have to be happy on Purim. But on Purim, it doesn't say how happy you have to be, because that happiness should be boundless. On Tisha B'Av, it tells you how sad you should be and the rules of the sadness, because that has a limit. So we see how Tisha B'Av is the specific day that's reserved for mourning, for sadness. But there are other customs that I want to look at for a moment, like when we read the book of Eicha, the Lamentations. Most of the book is about the destruction of Jerusalem. The prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, describes gut-wrenching words to tell us about this tragic moment of the temple's destruction. We're going to read it tonight in Shul and again tomorrow. All right, let's take a look at this. And he talks about how we have forsaken, we forsook God and God forsook. But yet, let's look at the very end. That's what I want to focus on, because time is limited. The very last chapter, what does he say? And we're all going to say it, and we're going to repeat it tonight. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. Return us to you, Hashem, and we will return to you. Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. Renew our days as days of old. And we repeat those words again. The final verse is not ending on a sad note. Or maybe it is, I don't know. I think it's something, maybe it's sad. Shouldn't say it's not sad. Return to us, I understand that. But it's not a sadness that ends with despair. That's the way I see it. It's a sadness that ends with what? It has hope, exactly. We'll return to you. We'll return to you. This marriage isn't over. There's hope. And the custom is to repeat that verse again, the second last verse, in order that we end on this uplifting note. Even if it's somewhat of a sad one, that we realize our distance, but we know there's hope. There's comfort in it. We don't negate the mourning, the sadness, the grief, the anguish. We just read about the destruction of the temple, the desolateness of Jerusalem. But we realize we have an opportunity to return to Hashem. So we don't settle with depressing sadness, as sad as the book of Lamentation is. And it has a very sad note to it, and the tune with which we're going to read it tonight. You could burst into tears just reading the 5 chapters. It's so sad, describing Jerusalem and the destruction and the murder and everything else that happened. It's a very depressing sadness. And the tune that our sages instituted to read it with is very, it puts us into the mode, right? It lowers our energy. We feel dejected. But as we conclude, we end on a high note. And is that not the idea that we read in Tanya, that the sadness is supposed to propel us, to be a springboard for growth, for coming out of it in a better way? And this is the idea that don't despair. We are realistic. We recognize, we look in the mirror, we see the tragic events. We don't deny them. We don't suppress it. We acknowledge it. But we don't end on a sad note. This past Shabbos, we read the Haftarah of Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah. Very sad, doom, gloom, destruction. But we concluded also there. Zion will be redeemed. And we are living in the era of redemption. Nobody could do in the last 2,000 years of exile. It is our generation, we who've seen the return to Jerusalem 56 years ago. in 1967, right? We are living in that time. So when we read these verses, we're not denying the sadness, but we're concluding that motivated us to become better and to realize there are better days to come. And I want to read this to you in the letter of the Rebbe right here, text 14. He says, when a person is constantly filled with thoughts and feelings of remorse over past misconduct, it is important to determine the source of these thoughts, whether they are emanating from the positive inclination, and that means you should be acting upon it. Why are you sad? Examine your sadness. Is this a sadness that's going to motivate you to become better? Or is it the evil inclination trying to pull us down even more? The best way of determining this is by examining the consequences of these thoughts. If the negative thoughts lead to additional energy and vitality in the performance of mitzvahs, that say, oh, how could I have acted this way? I better change and become better. And you know, that's good, right? Then I become a better person. This is proof that these thoughts come from a good place. And that's why God created sadness, because that sadness is the springboard. It's a dip, it's a challenge, which creates a window of opportunity. The very word Sarah, which means pain, has the same letters as the word Sohar, which means a window of opportunity. And Sohar also means a light. You have to realize, and actually, the very same letters spell the word Ritzay. We're playing some Scrabble here. You know how to play Scrabble? Just rearrange the letters. So first you have Tzara, Tzara's problems. But play with those letters, you get the word Ritzay. What does Ritzay mean? Desire, to want. If there's a will, there's a relative. I mean, if there's will, there's a way. There's a way. And if you have that will and desire, then you could take the negativity and springboard it. I'm sorry, I'm using funny language. And use it as an impetus. Galvanize yourself to Tzahar, to transform that challenge into an opportunity, into a shining light in your life. And that energy is the energy we need. And that's the point what the Rebbe is telling us here, that these feelings, especially feelings of sadness and regret and remorse, are best judged by the results, what's going to come from it. If the emotion leads towards renewed energy in fulfilling the Torah and the mitzvahs, then that's a sadness that can be cultivated. It leads to despair, and God forbid we're in the wrong place, which is why I put a slingshot here, because you always got to pull it back to yourself in order for it to propel further, right? And that's the point. It's this balanced approach to sadness which explains how we can continue to mourn for the destruction of the temple, even though it's 1,953 years ago that the temple was destroyed, and it's a long time ago. But we've never forgotten. We don't forget about a Holocaust. But Judaism is not about just having Holocaust museums. Sadly, for some people, that's become all their Judaism. Judaism is about going to shul and living your Yiddishkeit. Judaism is about having schools and shuls and activities and living and learning. That's Yiddishkeit. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was granted 3 wishes from Vespasian, who was the Roman general before Titus to destroy the temple, he didn't ask for the temple to be preserved, even though he regretted it years later. But he had the realization that it won't be bricks and mortar of a temple that will preserve Judaism. He realized it will be Jews who practice Judaism that will be able to preserve the future of the Jewish nation. So that grief, it's there, but it is not unlimited like the joy. The joy is limitless. Be as happy as you can be. Purposeful sadness is what we have on Tisha B'Av. It's contained. It's within this specific day. That the despair, that we shouldn't have a despair. We shouldn't give up. It's limited. It's confined. We have rules and laws. Don't be an Ibra Chacham and say, I'm going to mourn more than anybody else. Don't. We have, in fact, this week's parsha that tells us, don't change the law. Don't add, don't subtract, don't diminish, but rather let this motivate us to become better and to become and to grow from it. Now, I realize it's productive, it's meaningful, it's purposeful. And so, my friends, if we can use the sadness of Tisha B'Av as a motivator to change things for the better, but we realize that there's a deeper dimension to the sadness of Tisha B'Av, because after all, it is a sad day, right? And so I want to take a couple of more minutes with you, if you don't mind, until the internet goes out or until I finish my slides. and to tell us and to explore why after so many years after the temple lies in ruins. And by the way, there was a time, I believe, I read somewhere, that the Kotel was not visible like it is today. Do you know what the Romans, and I don't know which era it happened, they turned the Kotel into a garbage dump? And I believe it was only sometime in the 17 or 1800s that some wealthy Jews started planting gold coins on the garbage dump where the Kotel was, and they got people to remove all the garbage away. Who was it? Rabbi Haller, do you know? Was it a Montefiore or a Rothschild? Or it was one of the sages. But when? What era was that? What year? 1800s. So peculiar. If they have their Dome of the Rock up there, why would they turn this into the garbage dump? But that's the story. But the fact of the matter is, from our own personal experience, we all realize that a human being, we're all complex Homo sapiens. We are complex creatures, right? And we often feel contradictory feelings. We perceive conflicting aspects of the truth. It's even possible, the Zohar says, to feel sadness and joy simultaneously. You ever thought of such a thing? Look at this. Says the Zohar, weeping is lodged on one side of my heart and joy in the other. Hey, you ever heard of such a thing? But yeah, it's a natural phenomenon. People ever have that? So our sages tell us Tisha B'Av is one of those days. And there are forms of celebration and joy that are permitted even on Tisha B'Av. What kind? Let's read the halacha that talks about this. It's an ancient custom actually, that of the Talmud, what do? We celebrate. There's a cute video going around about the sadness, and then they go, oh, we're finishing a tractate of Talmud. We're finishing a Netflix series. See them. It's always been a joyous occasion. And in fact, some people even eat meat and drink wine during this week by having a siyum. That's only if you mamish can't exist a week without wine and meat. But it's a very special celebration. And many communities have a custom of finishing a tractate of Talmud every single day in this week. And even on Tisha B'Av, even though we're not going to have a party in Tisha B'Av. Says the halacha here, on the second night of Yom Tov, many tzaddikim, righteous men, are accustomed not to their homes in small numbers. It's also the custom that for the days at the beginning of Av, they finish tractates of the Talmud and eat feasts with meat and wine. So you see even here in the halacha. What is the whole point? Isn't this supposed to be a sad time when we're building up to the sadness of Tisha B'Av? But there is this concept that the Zohar says that you have the sadness and the joy at the same time. Continuing the halacha, both of these customs stem from the obligation and commandment to preempt the future redemptions. While we're sad, you know that we're going to read tonight in Eicha, that this day will transform, even though it's the saddest day on the calendar, but it's going to become a happy occasion. Even though we're commemorating all the tragic calamities that have befallen our people at this time, but we realize in the future times, Mashiach will come, the temple will be rebuilt, and this will become a time of rejoicing and celebration. And so, while we feel sadness, we also have hope. And that's the point. There is a hope. What's this hope about? I need you to read this verse, because the simultaneous joy and sadness of Tisha B'Av is a profound concept. And this, our sages trace all the way back to the story of when Joseph sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. And the brothers told their father a lie. What did they say about Joseph? They said he's dead. They said, Taraf Yosef. Joseph was devoured and torn up by an animal. That's what they tried to convince their father. But did their father buy it? We're told that Yaakov refused to be comforted. Read these words. Yaakov refused to be comforted. What does it mean to refuse? The sages tell us that Yaakov had a sneaking suspicion there was something inside him. As much as he cried and mourned for the passing of Yosef, because that's the story his kids sold him, there was something deep inside that he felt that he just couldn't be comforted. And the Rashi tells us here, one does not accept consolation for a living person presumed dead. Regarding the dead, God has decreed they will be forgotten from one's heart, but it has not been so decreed regarding the living. What does that mean? When a person passed on, regardless, how we feel about it, ultimately, there is some form of time heals. 1 second. But when a person's not really dead, you look at when people are taken captive, there's no sense of comfort until there's a closure. And Yaakov did not have that closure. And ultimately, it proved to his benefit because Yosef indeed was alive. And so the same thing our sages tell us is true about the morning of Tisha B'Av, that we have never been comforted about the destruction of the temple. We still mourn for it nearly 2,000 years later. And just to bring this text up over here, what it says, look at text 18. This is from the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer says, the sages tell us that Tisha B'Av is called a holiday on which we don't say Tachna. We don't say Tachna tomorrow. How can it achieve the status of a holiday when, unlike other holidays, when we feast, here we fast? Unlike holidays, we celebrate, and here we're mourning. He says this could be understood by contemplating how for close to 2,000 years during which we have been given all the blessings in the world, the Jewish people have yet to forget what happened on Tisha B'Av. We have yet to dry our eyes from the tragedy. Every other nation and tongue that has lost it has managed to forget their past calamities in light of the current blessings. Do we see Italy having processions to mourn for the downfall of the Roman Empire? Think about how mighty Rome once was. Did the Greeks do anything of that nature? How many nations are gone, lost, forgotten? Why are the Jewish people different, asks the Chassam Sofer. And let's continue here. He says, you want to know? We are different because we don't accept consolation for the living, whereas God decrees the dead to eventually be forgotten from one's heart. All of the nations have no hope to return to what they once had, to what they've lost, and therefore they forget. The British Empire is as wonderful as, King Charles is. It's a far cry from whatever they once were, right? And they've moved on from it. They acknowledge, they recognize the British Commonwealth will probably never be what it once was. But we as a Jewish people, we don't forget. Says the Chassam Sofer, we still have hope. We await the day in the future when God will ascend below, wreathed in flame, and his righteous ones will live again and see and be satisfied from his goodness. We don't accept consolation for the living, and therefore our mourning is actually for us the deepest comfort. It's called a great holiday. So Aubrey, when you talk about the Shekhinah being taken captive, but there's still a Shekhinah. And that's the point. It shows that we still know, and we will one day return to things as they were in the days of old. And that's the words we conclude Eicha with today. Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. Restore our days as they once were. The sadness of Tisha B'Av is not despondence, it's not dejection. Our sadness is a form of resistance to the cause of sadness. Our sadness is in a way itself some form of joy, right? It's a celebration of the fact that the dream of Mashiach, of the temple, is still alive. It's still, the embers are still burning in our hearts. And Tisha B'Av is the Jewish demand for that promised future, when our tears will be tears of joy. Maybe in a sense like Yom Kippur, when instead of being focused on the physical, we focus on the spiritual. That's why we don't eat and we don't engage and indulge in other actions that are of a physical nature. The sentiment that our sadness is really the impetus for our eventual joy. And let's look at this verse in text 19, what the Gemara says, that what do we say? Simchu es Yerushalayim. You know that song? Simchu et Yerushalayim, gilu ba kolo haveha, kolo haveha. Rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her, all who love her. Sisu otamasot kolo mitablim. Rejoice with joy with her and all who mourn for her. We sing about it. And from this we learn, says the Gemara, that whoever mourns for Yerushalayim, kol hamisaba Yerushalayim. Guess what? Zoiche v'roye b'simchasa. will merit to see her joy. We never gave up in Yerushalayim. And guess what? It's our day and age that we're living, that we could see it. But the Gemara concludes with sharp words. If you don't mourn for Jerusalem, you can't appreciate and rejoice in it. What's that? Yeah, of course, we keep saying Lashana Haba. The point the Gemara is making is, and this is something, what was the point I was going to say before? The Gemara says, the story the Talmud relates about the cow that lowed, it went moo, and the Arab animal language interpreter said, your temple's being destroyed. And then when it lowed again, another moo, wanted to get the musaf already. It was hungry for the kiddush, for the bracha. He said, no, now your Mashiach has been born. How could Mashiach be born on the very same day of the temple's destruction? How's that possible? But this is exactly the point we're making. Because within that sadness, we could find the joy. And that's why we end the book of Eicha tonight with this feeling of a much greater and better future. Joy and sorrow can be simultaneous feelings if we haven't given up. We realize, we feel it in ourselves. So, as we enter Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on our calendar, we realize there are going to be two opposing, conflicting feelings, sentiments that we have, right? And we combine that joy and sadness on this day of mourning, even 1,953 years after the temple's destruction, because the hope for the future redemption is not dead. That hope is still there. It continues to beat in every single one of our hearts. And please God, those feelings will materialize, will come to fruition for the ultimate redemption, when indeed we will be reunited with all our beloved, departed loved ones, and we will experience the return to Yerushalayim with all of us, not a temporary fix, but the ultimate one, seeing it restored to its full magnificence and glory in the coming of Mashiach. May it happen today. Instead of fasting, then we could feast. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to see you. I'm wishing you an easy and meaningful fast. If anybody wants to join us tonight at our shul, we're going to be showing a film before the fast, before Eicha. We have a short film. It's available on YouTube. You can watch it, but it's nicer to watch it together. That was produced about the destruction of the temple. And then afterwards, we're going to watch another film or two. One about Ella Blumenthal and another one called With My Whole Broken Heart. So I hope to see you all. You want to join us. I don't know what it's called. I have to look for it. I'll look for it right now. I'll find it. I'll show it to you. Pardon? The films will start after, the first one will start before Eicha. So Meyer will be quoted to 6. Probably 6 o'clock we'll do the first film. It's only about 9 minutes long or 16 minutes long, probably call. And then after Eicha will probably take an hour. No, not what, an hour. Eicha should probably take 25 minutes. And then after that, we're going to show the next film. It's about Ella Blumenthal. Henry Blumenthal's mother. And that's maybe a 45-minute film. Very, very interesting. And then maybe if there's time and people are interested, we could do another one called With My Whole Broken Heart.